No historian has a video of Muhammad walking through Mecca. No 7th century photograph. No passport. No government birth record. No personal diary in his own handwriting. And for some people, that silence sounds suspicious. But ancient and late antique history almost never gives us that kind of proof. The harder question is not whether we have a modern file. The harder question is what kind of trail a person from 7th century Arabia could realistically leave for Muhammad. That trail is complicated. Much of the story comes from Muslim tradition, written with faith and memory at its center. But the question does not end there. There are early non-Muslim notices, inscriptions, papyri, coins, manuscript fragments, political changes, and a new community that becomes visible with astonishing speed. This is not a video about proving revelation. It is about something narrower, and in some ways more interesting. What evidence can historians use when the founder of a world religion appears first through believers, enemies, administrators, and stones? The first trap is the word proof. When people ask whether Muhammad really existed, they often imagine a modern archive. They want a signed letter, a courtroom transcript, a neutral biography written the same year, or an inscription that says, "Here is the man, here is the date, here is the photograph." That is not how most 7th century people enter the record. Arabia in Muhammad's lifetime was not a bureaucratic world like modern Europe. It was connected to empires, trade, poetry, tribal memory, pilgrimage, and border politics, but it did not preserve ordinary lives in the way modern states do. Even powerful people from late antiquity can be hard to reconstruct. The records are copied, translated, lost, polemical, and fragmentary. So the historical question cannot be, do we have the kind of evidence a modern president would leave? The question is whether different kinds of evidence converge. Do the earliest communities remember a founder in a specific Arabian setting? Do outsiders notice the movement close to its beginning? Do inscriptions and papyri show the same names, formulas, places, and political changes? Does the Qur'an fit the world it claims to address? Do later biographies preserve memory, even when they also reshape it? That is the historical method. Not one perfect proof. A trail. The most detailed stories about Muhammad come from Muslim tradition. That includes the Qur'an, early community memory, biography, hadith, legal traditions, and later historical writing. But these sources are not all the same kind of evidence. The Qur'an is not a normal biography. It does not pause to give a neat childhood, a full timeline, or a modern profile of its messenger. It speaks into conflict, worship, law, warning, argument, memory, and community formation. It assumes a speaker, an audience, opponents, believers, rituals, and a world of late antique religious debate. Later biographies, especially the Sirah tradition, try to tell the story in a fuller narrative form. They are valuable, but they are also later shaped by transmission, politics, theology, and storytelling. That does not make them useless. Ancient historians use biased sources all the time. The question is not whether a source has a point of view. It always does. The question is what kind of memory it preserves, how early the memory may be, whether it fits other evidence, and where it becomes too neat, too legendary, or too convenient. For Muhammad, Muslim tradition gives the deepest internal memory. But historians do not have to stop there. One of the most important clues is that non-Muslim writers notice the Arab movement very early. They do not understand it the way Muslims understand it. They are often confused, hostile, fearful, or writing from a distance. That is exactly why historians pay attention. A text known as the Doctrina Jacobi, written in a Christian polemical setting not long after the Arab conquests began, refers to a prophet appearing among the Saracens. The details are not clean. The author is not trying to write a careful biography of Muhammad. The passage is filtered through rumor, fear, and religious argument. But it shows something important. Outside observers were already trying to explain the new Arab movement through a prophetic figure. Other early Christian and Armenian materials also connect the rise of the Arabs with a leader, teaching, monotheism, Abrahamic claims, and military expansion. These are not Muslim devotional texts. They are witnesses from the edge of the shockwave. They do not prove every detail in later biography. They do not give us Muhammad's face, voice, or full life. But they make it harder to say that the founder was invented only much later. The outside world noticed the movement too soon. Hostile sources are useful but dangerous. They can preserve facts that supporters would not invent, but they can also distort almost everything else. The early Christian notices about the Arab prophet were written by people trying to make sense of disaster. Roman and Persian power had been shaken. Cities were falling. Old religious maps were being redrawn. Rumor moved faster than careful information. So a historian has to be disciplined. A hostile source should not be treated as pure truth just because it is outside Islam. But it should not be ignored either. If an outside writer close to the events says there is a prophet among the Arabs, that is not the same as a late legend written centuries afterward. It is a trace of how the movement was being understood in real time, even if badly. The best use of these sources is narrow. They suggest that the Arab conquests were not seen as a random military event alone. Outsiders associated them with religious leadership and a prophetic claim. That basic outline lines up with Muslim memory, even when the details diverge. Different motives, different language. Same disturbance in the historical record. Then the material record starts to matter. Inscriptions do not tell a full life story, but they can be hard to move out of the way. By the late 7th century, public inscriptions begin to show the new religious language of the Islamic State. The Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, completed under Abd al-Malik, carries monumental Arabic inscriptions that proclaim God's oneness and refer to Muhammad as the messenger of God. This is not a later medieval manuscript. It is stone architecture, power, and public theology within living memory of the movement's beginning. It does not tell us what Muhammad ate for breakfast. It does not prove revelation. It does not provide a biography. But it shows that within decades, the name Muhammad stood at the center of an imperial religious message. That matters. A founder can be remembered wrongly. A founder can be interpreted through theology. But a public inscription that early makes a simple claim difficult to escape. Muhammad was not an invisible medieval invention appearing out of nowhere. His name had become a public marker of the new community's identity.
The quietest evidence is sometimes the most interesting.
Not the dramatic chronicle, not the miracle story, the receipt, the tax document, the coin, the administrative habit. Early Arabic and bilingual papyri show the new rulers organizing real provinces, collecting taxes, dating documents, and operating inside the conquered world. One famous 7th century papyrus from Egypt, often discussed under the label Perf 558, belongs to the early decades of Islamic rule and shows Arabic administration becoming visible in documentary form. Coins also change. At first, the new rulers adapt older Byzantine and Sasanian forms. Then the language shifts. Religious formulas grow clearer. Under Abd al-Malik, coinage becomes a public statement of the new order. This material does not give us a private portrait of Muhammad, but it shows the speed with which the movement attached itself to documents, money, rule, and public identity. That is historically important because invented founders usually need a social engine. Here, the engine is visible. A community connected to Muhammad becomes a state, and the state leaves paper, metal, stone, and architecture behind. The Quran itself is part of the evidence, but not in the way people often imagine. A manuscript does not prove that every later story about Muhammad is true. But early Quran manuscripts show that the text belongs very close to the beginning of Islam. Fragments such as the Birmingham Qur'an leaves have been radiocarbon dated to a range that overlaps the lifetime of Muhammad and the first generations after him. The Sana'a palimpsest shows an early Quranic manuscript tradition with textual layers, corrections, and transmission history. That is not embarrassing for historians. That is exactly what ancient texts look like when they move through real human hands. The important point is that the Quran is not a text first appearing in a distant medieval fog. It emerges in the world of early Islam in Arabic, in a community that treated it as authoritative. The text itself does not work like a biography. It rarely names Muhammad directly, but it speaks to a living community under pressure, and that community remembered the messenger as the center of its origin. The manuscript trail gives that memory weight. The Sirah and Hadith traditions create a different problem. They are later than the events they describe, and they preserve enormous detail. Journeys, battles, marriages, disputes, revelations, treaties, conversations, opponents, companions, and family names. Some of that detail may preserve old memory. Some of it may reflect later legal debates, political struggles, storytelling patterns, or attempts to explain difficult verses. Historians have to work carefully here. A later source is not automatically false. If that were the rule, much ancient history would collapse. But a later source is not automatically reliable either. The question becomes, does a report fit the earlier Quranic world? Does it appear in multiple lines of transmission? Does it explain something awkward rather than something convenient? Does it match what we know of late antique Arabia, tribal politics, pilgrimage, monotheist debate, and imperial pressure? This is where the historical Muhammad is hardest. The tradition is rich, but richness is not the same as certainty. The careful historian separates the basic existence of a founder from the fine detail of later biography. Those are not the same claim. The world around Muhammad is not empty. Late antique Arabia was not a blank desert waiting for history to begin. It was connected to Byzantium, Persia, Ethiopia, Yemen, Syria, trade, pilgrimage, tribal alliances, poetry, Jewish communities, Christian communities, and older Arabian religious practices. That matters because the Quran speaks into a world of argument. It debates scripture, prophecy, judgment, charity, idols, covenant, prayer, purity, and community boundaries. Those are not random ideas floating in nowhere. They belong to late antiquity. The rise of Islam also fits a moment when the great empires were exhausted by war. Byzantine and Sasanian power had been damaged. Frontier systems were strained. Local alliances could shift quickly. This does not explain Islam away. It gives the story a historical landscape. Muhammad appears in memory not as a fantasy king from an impossible world, but as a prophetic leader remembered inside real 7th century Arabia, at the edge of empires during a period when religious and political maps were breaking open. Weak arguments can damage a strong historical case. If someone says, "This coin proves the entire biography," they are going too far. If someone says, "This manuscript proves every miracle," they are making the wrong kind of claim. If someone treats every later story as a newspaper report, the method breaks. But the opposite mistake is just as bad. If every Muslim source is dismissed only because it is Muslim, then most ancient history becomes impossible. Roman history would lose Roman sources. Christian history would lose Christian sources. Jewish history would lose Jewish sources. Persian history would lose Persian royal memory. The question is not whether a source belongs to a community. The question is how to read it. For Muhammad, the strongest case is cumulative and restrained. Early Muslim memory centers a prophetic founder. Outsiders notice a prophet connected to the Arabs. Inscriptions make Muhammad a public religious name within decades. Papyri and coins show the new order becoming administrative fact. Qur'an manuscripts place the text close to the movement's beginning. No single piece does everything. Together they form a trail. So what can historians say with confidence? Not as faith, not as anti-faith, just as history. A man remembered as Muhammad stands very near the beginning of Islam. He is connected with Western Arabia, with Mecca and Medina in Muslim memory, with a prophetic claim, with a community shaped by the Qur'an, and with a movement that rapidly becomes visible outside Arabia. Historians can say that much more easily than they can reconstruct every episode in the later biography. The exact chronology of some events is debated. The details of early battles, speeches, treaties, and private conversations are harder. The relationship between Quranic passages and later narrative settings is complicated. The development of hadith and legal memory is one of the most difficult fields in Islamic origins. But those debates do not require the founder to be imaginary. In fact, most of them assume there was a founder whose memory became the center of argument. A person can be historical without every later claim about him being historically provable. A religious tradition can preserve real memory and interpret that memory through belief. That is not unusual. That is ancient history. The silence around Muhammad is real. We do not have a full neutral biography from the year he died. We do not have a personal archive. We do not have an official Meccan file. We do not have a contemporary portrait, and in this story, visual absence has its own religious and cultural meaning. But silence has to be measured against survival. What records should we expect from 7th century Western Arabia? How much local writing survived? How much was copied? How much was destroyed, ignored, or absorbed into later tradition? How often do founders of movements leave the kind of paperwork modern skeptics demand? The surprising thing is not that the record has gaps. The surprising thing is how quickly the movement becomes visible. Within decades, outsiders are reacting to the Arab prophet tradition. Public inscriptions name Muhammad. Administrative documents and coins show a new order. Qur'an manuscripts belong to the earliest Islamic centuries. Later Muslim tradition preserves a detailed memory that has to be read critically but cannot simply be thrown away. The footprint is not modern, but it is real. The most honest answer is quieter than the loudest argument. No, we do not have one perfect artifact that proves everything. No, non-Muslim sources do not give us a full biography. No, early manuscripts do not prove revelation. No, later Muslim tradition can be read without caution. But the opposite claim also fails. Muhammad is not a figure who appears from nowhere centuries later. The trail begins close to the rise of Islam and widens quickly. A community formed by the Qur'an, outsiders who hear of a prophet among the Arabs, inscriptions that publicly name Muhammad, documents and coins from a new state, and a late antique world that makes the movement historically intelligible. That is why the historical case is stronger than a simple dismissal and narrower than a devotional proof. It probably proves a person at the center of the movement. It does not prove every claim made about that person, and maybe that is the most useful distinction. History cannot replace faith, but it can follow a trail